I'd like to first introduce myself. My name is Michelle Villarreal, and I'm also joined by Monique Bassi. We're the Emerging Professionals Committee. On behalf of the chapter, we want to welcome everyone to this exciting lecture. We have a great group of panelists today, and we're looking forward to some really inspiring content and conversation. And a special thank you to our sponsor, Miracle Play Systems, designing play. I'd also like to share a few upcoming chapter events. On July 16th, we'll be hosting a live interactive pub quiz in honor of our annual Giants Night, which unfortunately was canceled this year. And as the first of our new event series titled Lunch with Leaders, Industry Icons, Pamela Conrad will be joining our group to dive deeper into her work with climate positive design. Please visit the chapter website or be on the lookout for emails from the chapter. And of course, we couldn't do it without you. If you're interested in being involved and showing leadership in your chapter and profession, we are looking for individuals to volunteer on multiple chapter committees. So please email Krista Van Hove at kvanhove@asla-ncc.org to get involved. And I'll let Monique take it away.
Yes, so we wanted to let everyone know that the Northern California chapter has recently released an action plan to take positive steps forward in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion with our chapter, profession, and communities. And in addition, our chapter has donated $5,000 to the Urban Studio, and we're super excited. If you all don't know, the Urban Studio expands how students of color are educated and engaged around design. So the mission of the Urban Studio is to advance design thinking for equitable and sustainable urbanism. And as designers of color working in communities of color, their goal is simple, to green cities for all people, which is awesome. We're super excited. So please visit us, visit our chapter website to read the entire action plan if you have not. In addition, we are looking for volunteers to support and contribute to the JEDI committee. So please contact our chapter president, Blake Reinhardt, if you are interested, and his information will be in the chat. Now let's get into our panel discussion for tonight, what we've all been waiting for. So the title for tonight's talk will allow us to take time to come together to touch base, if you will, and look towards the future within our careers and our personal lives. So the goal of the panel discussion is to inspire all professionals and students to find their voice through their career journey. We have 4 amazing panelists with varied backgrounds and experiences to share how they have aligned their passion and purpose with their careers. So we want to take this time to thank you all for being here, and thank you panelists for being here as well. We are excited, and this is going to be an amazing discussion. So first, our first panelist, we have 4 amazing panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. C.L. Bohannon. He is a professor of landscape architecture at Virginia Tech. Next, if there are any students from Virginia Tech, please shout out and say hello. Next, we have Kimberly Garza. She is the founder and principal at Atlas Lab in Sacramento, and she is the past president of the Sierra chapter. So Sierra chapter members, if you're out there, give her a shout out in the chat. We also have Tim Mollette-Park, principal at Methuen here in San Francisco. We're super excited to have him here. And last but certainly not least, we have Grace Mitchell-Tada, a designer at Hood Design Studio here in Oakland, which is awesome. So as we take this time tonight to hear from and be inspired by our panelists, I invite you all to also reflect on your own individual journeys, both personally and professionally. Following our passion requires growth, it requires courage, it requires bravery. And when your passion it also requires that you realize what your passion and purpose is, not only for your design, but your personal life. We've asked the panelists to share the challenges that they've faced and what has made them more resilient. We've also asked them to share with us important lessons that they've learned along the way. And also ask them, like, what's next? What is their call to action? Knowing that we're going through really interesting times right now, not only through systemic racism to COVID-19, these are all affecting the profession of landscape architecture. And so we are, called to action. We're called to make changes within the way that we practice within our personal lives. And so how are we doing that, and how are we being inspired to do so? And so we hope this inspires you to stay true to yourselves and your paths of growth, to honor not only your path, but the paths of others, to acknowledge that everyone's success and passions are different and should be different, and that realignment is important and necessary when life is challenging. So, next slide. So the event will flow. We will have presentations. So each panelist will present for 10 minutes. So there'll be about 40 minutes of presentation, followed by a Q&A discussion, which will be about 20 minutes. So please provide any questions, comments in the chat. Also chat it up as well. If you hear some awesome quotes, if you hear some great knowledge, please, chat it up so we can all see. And then we'll close with a closing comment. So now we will hand it off to CL, and he will present. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique.
Yeah.
I think you have to undo your sharing so I can share.
Oh, Michelle, but there you go.
Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just want to say thank you to the ASLA NCC Emerging Professionals Committee for inviting me to participate in this forum, and let's get started. We're curious to see what you guys think of this. I want to first start with a small piece that I wrote that reflects where I grew up. I'm a son of the Delta. I'm a product of sacrifice and hard work. I'm a descendant of lives that were gone too soon, and I am responsible to carry their legacies in the hope to make a more just world. I am my ancestors' wildest dream. These two gentlemen here were very influential in my life as a designer. John Jackson, landscape architect, and my late father, Samuel Turner III, architect. My life was a little bit different. The first landscape architect I ever met was an African-American landscape architect. And, the passion that I saw with the work that he was doing and the work that he was doing with my father really started me on the path to try to figure out how could I, become a part of this, of a profession or a group of professionals that could have a positive impact on a community. I hadn't thought at the time about a profession that was, could be or would be responsible for the design and management of green spaces before seeing their work. And so from that point, I went on, from the city of Memphis to the University of Arkansas, which was, for me, a very challenging time coming from Memphis, which was at that time 75% African-American, to go study in the mountains. It was a big challenge, it was a big change. Many times I didn't feel like I belonged in the program or belonged in the university. But I had some very influential faculty members, Judy Brittenham, Fran Beatty, and Mark Boyer, who really pushed me along and allowed me to it allowed me to be in a space to find my voice. And I would later go on to graduate from the program. I think I was the second African-American to graduate from that program, and that was in 2002. So that's a moment of challenge, and how do you overcome that? And then I had the fortunate opportunity to go to Virginia Tech as part of a multicultural academic opportunities program, and also later on to study landscape architecture at the graduate level. And this was really the first time that I saw landscape architecture or was exposed to the research side, design research side of landscape architecture. And it really provided me new ways to question the world around me. I got a really solid education at Arkansas, but my eyes really opened to the ways that they were teaching then and still now here at Virginia Tech. And I will go on to finish my MLA and really get into community development work, really studying about urban catalysts, which really was the linchpin for the type of work that I continue to do today. I then had a chance, talking about fortunate opportunities, to go to work at Florida A&M University, which at the time was one of 3 historically Black colleges and universities that actually had a landscape architecture program. And I spent 4 years really cutting my teeth in teaching. They trusted a lot for a 24-year-old professor to come down and to help really get the program. It was already started, but really to push it in a new direction there. And so I would say, the program is no longer there, but my heart is always imbued to FAMU for giving me a chance to really start teaching and really start to realize the impact of having African-American voices in higher education in design. Really important milestone and still a really important place there. And it's really here that my work with community engagement really started with some of the communities that surround the university there in Tallahassee. And so that really, the time there working with communities, working on issues that were facing, the communities that I grew up with, and seeing the same issues there in Tallahassee really pushed me to maybe think about design research and getting my PhD. And so I came back to Virginia Tech. I guess I'm still here now, but came back to Tech and again, those relationships that you build with someone. This is Dr. Patrick Miller, who's now Professor Emeritus, but my time as a MAOP intern that I mentioned before I started graduate school at Virginia Tech, he was my first advisor who really taught me a lot about design research and ways that you can, question the world and use design and design research in ways that are really impactful. And he was also my thesis or my dissertation advisor. And with that study under Dr. Miller, my research really focused on the perceptions of community engagement, the faculty perceptions of community engagement, and ways to really understand how faculty in landscape architecture were utilizing engagement in the curricular activities in their programs at different levels, and also how engagement mapped onto faculty's research and publication record and tenure record in their fields, I guess. So with that really pushed me to think about, okay, now I can use engagement as a way to push forward. And the work that I do now, community engagement and community engaged design really, for me, it enables landscape architects to work with real people in real places on real problems, and it helps us interrogate systems of power that produce uneven social and environmental impacts on marginalized communities. And I believe that this ethos not only grounds my research and my pedagogical approach, but it also provides an actionable framework for comprehensive outreach that really starts to bring students, faculty, and community members together to understand how and why design processes can come together, to why design processes can be both productive and responsive to inequalities in the built environment. And this slide you see here, disruptive engagement, is something that we use in the community engagement lab that I run, that helps us think about ways that how we can create a new system of design to disrupt basically old systems that perpetuate inequalities in the built environment. And so that brings me to Appalachia, which is where we're situated here in Virginia within the larger context. So you think about the landscape here is rich in resources. I see a lot of the same issues and problems that I experienced, growing up in Memphis, Tennessee. I see those here. The image you see here is mountaintop removal. When I talked about things being high in resources, the people in the land are some of the resources that are mostly extracted, basically due to capitalistic forces, and which makes this landscape one of the most hazardous landscapes to actually live in the country, even though it's completely beautiful here. So that brings me to this notion of really trying to understand resilience and engagement, how those two map onto each other. And it makes me think about how we as designers should be asking different questions of when we think about how design can be used to address issues of inequality and equity. I also feel that landscape architects, I think we have an obligation to interrogate our own practices, and particularly in the ways that we have been complicit in the past and probably still are in many ways as contributors to inequalities in our society. For example, this is Roanoke, Virginia, which is about 30 minutes from campus. This is a place, this story pans out in a lot of different cities, but I'll contextualize it in urban Appalachia here in terms of lasting impacts of redlining, urban renewal, et cetera. In this particular case, this is dealing with urban renewal era infrastructure, where an interstate was put in place to connect I-81 to Highway 220. And you can see in orange the road corridor that was put in, and you can see some of the areas in red there. Those are some of the developments that were put in place. This displacement, this road displaced a number of community members and pushed them towards the Gainesboro neighborhood that you see to the left there, and also push more development in that way. The displacement of these communities has had lasting effects in terms of food insecurity, high rates of vacancy in the communities, high rates of health disparities. And so a good portion of the work and the community engagement that we do focuses on working with these communities in Roanoke that are, basically, the conditions that they're in are not happenstance. These things were planned and are a legacy of, quite frankly, racist design schemes and policies that were put in place. This also allows me, in terms of kind of another touch point. We have the landscape architecture program here. We have the College of Architecture and Design, but I also have a unique role as a faculty principal and leader of one of the residential colleges. So now I get a chance to take some design thinking and imbue that in students that are majors across our university, across our 9 colleges here at Virginia Tech, and to really get them to think about how their work intersects with developing them as leaders, but also how their work should be impactful in creating positive social change. And so with this, we try to get the students to really embrace an ethos of social responsibility as part of their work. We want them to develop and undertake programming that actually empowers them to become inclusive leaders, equitable leaders, and sustainable leaders beyond their time here at Virginia Tech, but as citizens in the world. And then also to understand the interconnectedness of problems. A lot of things that we see that are happening in society are linked together. It's hard to separate them out. So that's one of the kind of the things that I'm doing now through, that has led up to this point, to be able to take some design thinking, to take a chance where we have a certain number of students in landscape architecture who get to hear me all the time, but now, we have 350 students who now get a chance to hear about our profession and what we do and how their work can maybe have some influences there. So with this work, it actually leads me to the work that I'm doing now. And Monique talked about, the context of society and what's happening with protests and contested narratives and things like that. And so this is the realm where my work is focused now. I do live in Virginia. We do have a lot of Confederate monuments. We have the most in the country, not too far away from here. We actually have a couple in our area as well. So now I'm working on actually finishing up a book, edited volume that looks at or explores African-American experiences in the landscape from Jim Crow to the present. And, you know, I do definitely believe that we're in a movement, not necessarily just a singular moment, but a movement to really question the existence of symbols and, you know, of contested histories. Do they belong? Do they not belong? What are the responses? What is our obligation as designers to actually to deal with that? And, you know, this is Richmond. I mean, this is Robert E. Lee's monument on Monument Avenue, and you can see the protest, you can see the anger, you can see that it's, you know, been it's almost like every message, every tweet known to man that's, you know, physically been painted on the structure now. And so this also makes me return home and to think about my own family's legacy and how it has been affected by Confederate narratives and Confederate ways of being in the South. And so the guy that you see on the far left is Nathan Bedford Forrest, who we know was a general and pretty evil guy, but he's also known as you know, the Grand Wizard of the KKK. His legacy and his tie to my family comes to his time when he was in the city of Memphis and was hired to actually extend the railroad west to Little Rock through this town called Forest City, which bears his name. But I show you this set of images because my great uncle Willie actually lives in a community that used to be the farm that fed basically Nathan Bedford Forrest's army that was tilled on and worked in by African-American labor, which is actually the second oldest community in the city that was actually open for African Americans to purchase land, which also was part of an urban renewal era infrastructure. The first being a 5,000 acre plantation now known as Orange Mound in the city. And so now I'm going back and trying to tracing these narratives, having conversations with my family about their experiences living in Jim Crow South and you know, growing up, working and living in the Delta landscape. So I have a lot to do. It is painful work, but the arc of knowing and the arc of being able to have the bravery, I guess, and the courage to ask these questions and to unpack these lived experiences in the landscape and the narrative that sometimes gets overlooked is kind of where my work is situated and the ways that I try to get my students to think about the world as well. And so, as I said earlier in the piece that I wrote, I am responsible to carry forward their legacies in the hope to make a more just world. Thank you all.
Awesome, that was amazing. Thank you so much, CL. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
All right, Kimberly's up next.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Thank you, CL, for that. That was really great. Hi, everyone. My name is Kimberly Garza. I'm founder and principal of Atlas Lab. Atlas Lab is a urban design, landscape architecture, and public art practice located in Sacramento, California. I'm very proud to say I'm from Sacramento. I moved away and came back, but today, you know, I like to just kind of share the story of Atlas and hopefully it will provide you guys some tools as emerging professionals of how to move forward. But at Atlas, really the mission is that we create with purpose. The way people interact and feel in a space is the foundation to everything we do. We are extremely passionate about bringing humanistic and artistic design solutions to cities that are historically, culturally, and ecologically responsive. And our work really balances whimsy with architectural rigor, testing materials and technology. And so with that, Atlas really started in 2011 as a think tank and transitioned in 2017. And full disclosure, I'm 36 years old, so I started my own practice when I was 33 years old, and it really took a lot of pushing from friends to just do it. So first kind of advice is, listen to your friends, but because you can always kind of doubt yourself. And so I really kind of want to talk about that journey with you. And I think the best way to kind of start talking about that is just kind of my professional trajectory over the last 20 years. I've been working in the design industry actually as a teenager. It's really odd. My mom's first generation. Nobody in my family has ever dabbled in design. I learned about landscape architecture, discovered it and actually in college. But kind of my background while I was at UC Berkeley pursuing my undergraduate degree in landscape architecture is that I was constantly working. I worked at architecture studios building models, then worked at Peter Walker doing physical model making there. And then upon graduation, moved to Texas where I had worked 3 years at a large kind of more corporate scale firm. And then went to graduate school at Harvard and also worked at many different interned at firms while I was up there. But in that process of working at these different firms, it really gave me great perspective on what I like. Do I like a small firm? Do I like a large firm? What's my comfort level? What size of firm that felt comfortable, and kind of what work did I really want to engage in? And so upon graduation, had a huge, debt I had to pay off. And so worked in Boston for a few years, but that's when I started Atlas Lab. And that really came out and was born out of when I went to graduate school. I really didn't know what my voice was anymore. I knew that I loved landscape, but the real reason I got into landscape architecture was through the arts, through the lens of the arts. And, my heroes being, Maya Lin, and, that was really, I thought about it as like, what was really the gateway for me into landscape architecture was her work and the work of Michael Heiser and Burle Marx. And so this was really why I got into landscape and why I was so interested in it. But I found when I started working, I wasn't doing this work. I was doing, I was doing residential communities. I was doing a lot of work that really wasn't aligned with, environmental art in any way. And not to say it needed to be exclusively about that, but I kind of felt like I lost my voice. And so I started Atlas as really a way to continue to explore those. So I would work nights and weekends, in addition to working a, full-time job, just working and just experimenting. And so through that, I just pursued several different competitions, different installations. I was never making, as we've learned, as you're starting career, you realize how long it takes to build landscapes. And so that was very frustrating for me because I felt like I hadn't been able to really build anything. So I said, let me just start small. So here, for example, is a project called Peak Experience, where I brought rubberized mounds that mimicked the hills of San Francisco and brought them to Market Street, which is a very hostile street, as we all know. And said, I want to bring play. I want to bring some playfulness to it. I want to bring family-friendly components to Market Street, and created these rubberized mounds. So he got them, designed them, got them milled, and brought them out. And that was really, gave me a great taste of like, wow, I can make an impact very fast. And these are the moments that really are, career changing. It was like, wow, just watching families and kids interact with it was really transformative. And then I continued to just do that on my own. I wanted to create a dialogue here in Sacramento about our severed connection to the river. And so I created this, what I call the micro dune. I got a small community grant and also, solicited, kind of GoFundMe funds to help kind of support and bring this kind of temporary dune that would travel, to different areas in Sacramento. And this was essentially creating this kind of pop-up park, but I also used that to, engage the community and have discussions about our open space and the river. Likewise, collaborated with hundreds of community members on this project where I created a light-based installation. Worked with a great friend of mine who helped produce the events that occurred on the street. But we essentially, took a street that was felt really unsafe, and neighbors reached out to us and said, thank you so much. I felt, so much more comfortable going down the street. But what we essentially did was we took this vacant street that people were kind of a little nervous about and transformed it into a beacon for art to occur. And we hosted over 20 events and representing, 20 different local organizations to, occupy the space. Likewise, I did another, temporary installations using milk crates, to create a kind of temporary seating and play experience. But again, all of that was just things that I was doing on the side in addition to my job. And so what was great is that I started then applying that to my practice and started to kind of merge the two different worlds together, and worked pro bono initially to get a dog park to Midtown in Sacramento. Currently, it was a vacant lot; nothing was used of it. Several community members came forward and said, "I want to create, a dog park here. Let's." And so I just kind of worked with them, and we were able to bring it. And so it was again able to bring those more creative and playful elements to the park itself. And then that work is really then translated into me working with different community organizations on different corridor plans, different placemaking plans, and how we can transform and start to activate different sites throughout Sacramento. And which also then has propelled kind of, my presence as a kind of, design leader in the region. And that kind of propelled us to work on the Sacramento waterfront feasibility study, where we developed this for the competition, which kind of then translated to a feasibility study where we looked at transforming Sacramento's waterfront. And then likewise, all of that work has helped then continue to have an amazing, for Atlas to have a public art presence. So in this case, we're working on the Sacramento Convention Center public art. We're proposing a 24-foot tall sculpture. The wood, it's actually a mosaic of wood that essentially represents all the wood that we've lost in the last decade due to climate change. And so it's been amazing taking those temporary installations that cost a few $1,000s, $5,000 to public artwork that, were commissioned at $250,000. So that's been really amazing. And I think these are things that, as young professionals, that the things you can do now can start, forming the future work you're engaged with. And then also that has also translated in us to engage with work with, several community members and different associations in Sacramento, and helping them kind of reconceive their public realms as well. And so in 2017, when Atlas was formalized, incorporated, and I had the guts to finally go out and do my own practice, it was a series of kind of smaller scale art installations, and how that's translated to work that's more permanent but still playful. But it definitely runs, anytime we're asked for help in the community, we say yes. That's really part of our mission. When needed, we reach, we always help out as best we can, but we also are balancing that with larger commission work, which has been really great. And so my advice to folks joining on the call tonight is that, there's ways to get involved. And if you may feel that you're working and you're not currently involved in your community, there's ways to get involved. And these are just several ways that has helped me, which is, getting involved in your local, ASLA chapter, or any particular organization that you appreciate their mission. Getting involved. And I just thought it was really important, since, in Sacramento, landscape architecture is a little bit smaller, that it was really important for us landscape architects to stay connected. And so serving as past president, as part of the Sierra chapter, has really been great. And also bringing, Parking Day to Sacramento, which, nobody knows about landscape. And so we host this event every year, and it's been really great. And then also, mentorship through teaching. It's been really great to, I've had the opportunity to teach at UC Davis for the last several years. I'm on a bit of a hiatus as I just, I've had a baby this past year, but teaching has been really helpful because it just makes your brain think in a different way, and, with a different set of design challenges to share with the students. So that's also been really great, and how I always try to connect those projects to real life projects that are happening in the city, and how they can, how students can get further connected to the community. And then again, calls to action. Stephon Clark was, wrongfully gunned down in the backyard of his grandmother's home. We immediately jumped up. We were angered and jumped up and say, how can we be part of this healing process? And worked with a handful of different organizations and nonprofits, and worked to transform the grandmother's home, and we completely redid the entire exterior spaces of that. And so again, we just take on pro bono projects that kind of support our mission as well. And then also just get it active with local, regional and national boards. Sit on review panels as much as you can. These are different boards I'm, a part of, and how, expanding your audience and being able to kind of educate people about landscape architecture is also important too. And then sitting on juries, that's been really great. The, invitations to sit on juries has been really great. And then also just pushing the dialogue as much as you can through publications, competitions, and research initiatives. So with that, this is my final slide. I just want to say, for anybody out there, stop waiting for an opportunity, jump at it and go for it. Grab some friends, and if you see something that's bothering you, do something about it. Next thing is to, always have gratitude, trust your instincts, is really, some great, things that I didn't have for myself that really my friends and family really pushed me. And also just to stay nimble and flexible, I think is important. That's when has been really great as a small startup, is that that's being a small office. We're an office of 5. And so it's been during COVID, we've been able to stay home and we haven't had really hiccups in our ability to produce work, and that's been great. And always just experiment. If you try something out, you might not like it, and then you'll just know in the future, hey, I don't want to do that. But I think it always is a great learning experience. So with that, I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. That was awesome. All right, so Tim is up next.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Yeah, thank you. Thanks to ASLA and to all the CL, Kimberly, Grace, all the other presenters. Fascinating conversations. So yeah, I'm Tim Mollette-Parks. I am a principal at Methuen. Methuen is an integrated design operation in San Francisco, and Seattle, and Los Angeles. We're landscape architects, urban designers, interior architects, all working together, and with hopefully very blurred lines between us in a collaborative way. So when I started thinking about pulling together some images to talk about the topics that Monique was laying out at the start here, this comment kept resonating with me. I've been listening a lot to this conversation between James Baldwin and Studs Terkel back in 1961. If you haven't heard this, it's an easy look up on the web. The conversation is deeply resonant, I find, related to current work towards justice and anti-racism. Also, this thought about having to decide who you are and then forcing the world to deal with you and not with its idea of you, also really, I think, has bearing in this conversation around, finding your voice. And deciding who you are is a different process for everybody, obviously. It's, I think, ongoing, maybe for some of us, for me included. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, what it means to me, which, requires talking about myself a little, which is I find a little weird, but I'm going to give it a shot. So, and here's a little bit of overlap with some things you heard and saw from CL's wonderful remarks. But I grew up in East Kentucky, along the border of West Virginia and Virginia. It's when I was coming up, coal was king. This is kind of what coal mining looked like in my hometown. When I was a kid, you know, it was folks underground with big machinery. By the time I left for undergrad, this is what coal mining looked like. This used to be Cinder Knob along the border of Perry County and Breathitt County in rural East Kentucky. I knew this mountain pretty well growing up. And of course, it is no more. And that kind of landscape of extraction, the kind of landscape of capitalist extraction, looking back, I think was really what started driving me towards thinking about landscapes, the punishment of the local ecosystem, the blinding wealth inequality that comes from thinking about landscapes in this way. And I think understanding how sort of deeply intertwined and vulnerable people are and landscapes are to one another in that kind of context is, I think, been an ongoing driver in my mind. But moving towards landscape wasn't something that I did initially. I left my hometown and studied journalism first. I spent a few years as a print journalist in Kansas City, in Charlotte, North Carolina, in Chicago, Illinois. I had a couple of weird pivots throughout, a brief flirtation as a musician. I was in a couple of bluegrass bands. I wrote a score for a couple of documentaries, and then eventually got to Berkeley and kind of returned to that sort of fascination with landscape. But I've tried to think in the last few days sort of what those odd pivots might have in common. And I've sort of thought about how when those three sort of endeavors are at their best, they're highly collaborative. They're all really based in listening, and they're also based in sharing stories. And it's important for me to talk about it as story sharing, not storytelling. I think that's a minor but important language difference. And you know, I believe that, you know, stories that ought to be shared and amplified first and loudest are the ones that are unheard or overlooked. And those are the ones that ought to be heard in their entirety and in their fullness. And I believe that telling those stories can lead to positive action for the most vulnerable among us. Along those sort of three paths, I've consistently have been incredibly fortunate, privileged, and lucky to have mentors and teachers along the way who were willing to support and sort of, you know, reach out to me where I was and engage and say, you know, wherever you're at is cool as long as you're aware of it and that you're always asking questions about what's next. And I'm going to share some things I've learned from three mentors, which means I'm leaving out incredibly important people to me at heartbreaking kind of level. But Jeff Bailey, Randy Hester, Linda Jewell, Chip Sullivan, Barb Barrow, Calder Gillen, Jordan Zlotoff, Ann Torney, Antonio Parez, people that I would be happy to talk about everything I've learned from those folks too. But the three I want to sort of share today. The first is Libby Frost, who was a journalism professor for me, who my takeaways that I want to share from her were she was the person who taught me what it meant to speak truth to power, and that if you're going to do that, you may have to occasionally raise your voice. You may have to shout once in a while. And she also instilled in me how crucial language is. And that's important to me, both in terms of words, but also as it relates to objects of design and the language of design, and how its specificity is so critical. It's probably difficult for me to parse out everything in all the ways that I learned from Walter Hood. It's just kind of hardwired in me now. Once in a while, I'll catch myself talking with colleagues at Methuen at a pinup and hear myself say something. I was like, that sounded a little like Walter. I first met him as a professor at Berkeley, and then I spent about 5 years or so working at Hood Design, the last two as a principal, running and designing projects. And what I learned from that experience and what I learned from Walter was really, I think, about the life of a designer, that it should resonate with you every day. You have to always be in it. You're finding inspiration anywhere in it all the time. And that, you know, as a designer, any drawing, any model, any detail you make, any conversation you have, any space you're thinking about has the potential to be wonderful, be transformative for the people who live there, work there, play there, and that we have an obligation to understand that and to take it deeply seriously and always be striving for the next best idea. And then the third I wanted to share is I continue to work with, so continue to get inspired by her, Deb Gunther. This is, Deb is in black, second from the right there. Here we are with some of our colleagues at Methuen. And a couple of the really wonderfully succinct ideas that Deb brings up often in our work, and I continue to latch onto. One is that process is as important as outcome, that when you're looking to do really transformative work, the process is critical, and that you need to proceed along that process with a patient urgency. Kimberly mentioned landscape work takes a while to finish and to get right, and even more so with the more complicated problems that you're attempting to engage with. One of the projects, series of projects really that Deb has been a leader on with us is in North Richmond, a community that is in one way similar to where I grew up, in that it's also a landscape of a capitalist extraction, in this case a fence line community adjacent to a Chevron oil refinery that's triggered massive ecological issues, health disparities, income disparities. North Richmond's also spent generations enduring racist housing practices. And to, you know, be engaged with this community first came through our involvement in the Resilient by Design initiative, but since then, thinking about Deb's inspiration around being patiently urgent and staying focused on the process has led us to stay involved in working in the community and trying to just, you know, be a part of the leaders in that community's efforts to continue to bring some of the ideas that we put forward during RBD towards completion. And the last kind of anecdote I wanted to leave with you was about refocus, which is also something I think Monique kind of touched on at the beginning. A few years ago, 2017 or so, I was starting to feel like maybe I had sort of begun to sort of lose the sort of strand of, you know, value and personal passion that I think I had previously. And I also, to Kimberly's point, I just reached out to a group called the Land Art Generator, LOGGY, sometimes they're called. Some of you may know these folks, Elizabeth and Robert, who started the organization, wonderful folks. But their idea is about reaching some sort of post-carbon, post-extractive idea for renewable energy, and also its ability to be art and public space. Really, I found a logical, you know, sort of companion to the things I'd been struggling with, thinking about the landscape I grew up in and some of, you know, the current work that we do. And I just, you know, reached them and self-nominated nominated myself to be on their board, and they did eventually add me to the board. And shortly after that, they got a call from a group working on the border between Kentucky and West Virginia, about 30 minutes from where I grew up. And in Williamson, West Virginia, where my mother managed a restaurant. She was a single working mother. And anyway, it was just one of those moments where being open to the reset and advocating for and getting out there and finding people of like mind yielded a really important opportunity and humbling experience for me to be able to, you know, return to where I grew up and talk about these same issues that I've been itching to work with professionally. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you so much. All right, so our last presenter is Grace. Take it away.
Okay, let's see. Sorry, guys, just a second. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks all of you, CL, Kimberly, Tim, Michelle, Monique. It's been great to hear everyone's stories, and so much of what everyone says just resonates so much with my own path. And but you know, I'm definitely at the beginning of my career, so hopefully what I share is, you know, maybe closer to some of the emerging professionals' paths. And I just want to talk a little bit about my own projects that I have in landscape that are not maybe traditional. So I'm going to share with you a few things that I've been working on that I started on working in school and I continue to do now. So I work at Hood Design Studio, and I'm presently working in a research and editing capacity with Walter Hood. And I started working with Walter as a graduate student. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about work I did in school and then work that I do now. So most of my work, I've kind of, you know, I think as everyone has talked about here, I've really been trying to figure out what I want my niche to sort of be in landscape. And I found out I really love communicating about either the work of landscape architects or about issues that I've learned about through my own work and research in the field of landscape architecture. And at Berkeley, I ended up enrolling in some environmental journalism courses at the School of Journalism. And doing that really helped me gain some important tools for sort of figuring out what I wanted to do and what I wanted my place to be in the landscape architecture field. From studios I took with Christina Hill, I started learning about the issue of groundwater rise, rising groundwater tables as a corollary to sea level rise. And it made me realize how many issues we encounter as designers, but that don't get communicated to the public because we're so busy doing the work. And as such, I reported a piece about research being done in the Bay Area on groundwater rise and the key role that planners and designers can play in making sure the issue is addressed and accounted for in climate adaptation plans. And I really sort of started getting hooked to that sort of role in between designers and the public when, after it was published, the Cal EPA's climate program manager reached out to Christina Hill for consultation, and so did a local grassroots organization who invited Hill to present in front of hundreds of people about this issue. And it sort of, yeah, like I said, I just got hooked to this sort of being able to talk about design in this way that really reached a lot of people. And from there, I traveled to Hawaii, where almost a decade ago, the research on rising groundwater tables initially started. And of course, as an island community, it's especially vulnerable to sea level rise. And I was interested in reporting on their efforts going on there to address rising groundwater. So of course, they're already seeing significant flooding from this issue. And so it's a piece I'm still working on, and I'm still in touch with people in Hawaii. So hopefully that will be published soon. And then now I'm going to talk a little bit about my work with Walter Hood. Like Tim, Walter has had a very profound effect on just how I think about landscape and just how just I am as a person, but of course how I approach my work. So I started working with him as a student. I was interested in his work on memory and difference in landscape, and especially as they pertain to often disinvested or overlooked communities. And I started working for him following a lecture series entitled Black Landscapes Matter, when we began to compile the lectures into a book that will be published this fall. And the essays look at different places around the US, and they look at the widespread and endemic racism that's in this country's built environment, and the sort of intentional forgetting and erasure of Black cultural landscapes that happen everywhere. And they examine dismissed histories, they offer case studies, and they ask how design work and how design education can change this narrative of erasure that's just so common in how we approach how landscapes have been approached in our country for hundreds of years, and just how often the work gets approached. And we're currently working on another book project, tentatively called Memorial to Our Ancestors, that documents the design process surrounding the International African American Museum, which is slated to open next fall in Charleston, South Carolina. And this volume will collect essays from all the architects, museum designers, historians, and so many others who've been part of the process of the museum, and it will speak to the importance of the museum and the museum at this site, as well as the design process that went into developing it. And our hope is really that the book will serve as another mode of articulating the power of memorialization, and acknowledging and examining the power that it has on our culture, to really symbolize what we value as a culture. And finally, I'm going to talk about work that I was involved in last summer, and that I hope to soon resume, but is on hold for all the reasons going on in the world right now. I spent last summer working in Normandy, France, with the French Ministry of Culture through a program sponsored by the International Council on Monuments and Sites, which is the advising organization of UNESCO. And I was involved in researching the cultural landscape of the World War II 1944 Allied D-Day landings, and their fragility as they face rising sea levels, over tourism, urbanization, and natural coastal evolution. And it's also a cultural landscape that faces a lot of challenges of aligning often divergent visions of preservation and memorialization between the different countries that all have stake in this landscape. And regardless, the Normandy coast represents a seminal material legacy in the remembrance of World War II for both residents and tourists. And it's a territory that's grappling with articulating its cultural memories in the face of climate change and shifting attitudes around memorialization, controversial histories, and all of these issues at the D-Day sites are issues that are faced by cultural landscapes around the world. So that was really interesting for me to really submerge myself in this landscape in a very particular and specific way, but then just continually realize how much resonance it has, both in the US and just globally. So for instance, does one preserve or let crumble into the sea the remains of the German Atlantic Wall, which is shown here, which is a physical reminder of just all of the hardships faced by the French citizens during the Second World War? Does saving the site inherently validate them, or can preserving them offer opportunities to learn from? Or what about the fact that naming the site as globally important, such as a UNESCO designation would do, which it does not currently have, but doing so would uphold the outsized narratives of colonial powers. So there's just lots of questions about what role memory and history has to our current relationship with the landscape and just our current relationship with each other in it. And you know, these aren't easy questions, and there's not easy answers. And like I said, there are questions that are happening in France and that we're similarly facing here in the US. And you know, some of the answers to these questions are really clear, and that's becoming evident in all the conversations that we are having now. But then some of the areas are gray, and it's, you know, it's hard to have these discussions and figure out what's right. So that's where I'm going to end, leaving it with all of you too, thinking about how landscape and its power as a visual and physical medium can really assert what sort of cultural values we have as a society. But yeah, I hope that just in terms of being a young professional and sort of forging what sort of path you have, I hope that that sort of gave an idea of the sort of variety of ways one can approach landscape architecture career. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very, very inspirational. And so we're going to open up the floor to ask if any of the audience members have questions that they'd like to pose to our panelists. And if we don't, that's okay. We also are opening up the floor to our panelists to ask each other questions.
I think we have a couple of questions coming in, actually.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Let's see. So Rex has a question for the panelist. With teaching experience, the panelist with teaching experience, so I guess CL, what inspired you to get into a teaching position after practicing LA? And what are the biggest takeaways you took from that and apply that back into the professional practice?
Yeah, I can take a shot at that. All right. I guess for me, you know, I practiced up until I got my PhD. I'm not practicing anymore because I'm too busy doing other stuff. But the things that really for me that inspired me to go into teaching is the fact that I went through undergrad, graduate, and my PhD, and there was no faculty members who looked exactly like me. And so that's why I went into teaching, right? And so I know that, you know, through my practice, I could have an influence on, you know, the built environment with communities and things like that. But I thought that getting into teaching, that I can help be part of the solution as to why we only have, you know, 2% African Americans graduating in landscape architecture across the board. And so, which I'm still critical of that, even though I'm part of, you know, thinking of, you know, being part of the solution. And so for me, it's one of those things where it's like, how can you, again, create a system that can upset or disrupt the system? So for me, getting into, back into the, you know, from practice into teaching, it was a way to have a broader influence on the way that landscape architecture is taught, but also how it's practiced. You know, being more mindful of community needs, being more mindful about listening first before you design, and actually working with and not on. And so those are some of the things that I will hope that my students, when they go out into practice, are actually doing.
All right. Is there anyone else who would like to answer that question? Yeah.
And I think since CL was talking about disruptive engagement, we have not a question per se, but Ian wanted to hear more about disruptive engagement.
Yeah. So disruptive engagement is something that we've been, utilizing in the lab as a way to look at community engaged design research. And it's something where we use it as a theory, but also as a kind of a method and a way of seeing and creating knowledge that, you look at, like, you can chronicle the past about what has happened, but you can also look towards the future in terms of creating models, meaning if things in terms of negative impacts on communities will continue to happen if we do not act, if we do not interrogate our systems, if we do not interrogate the ways in which we practice, how we teach, how we act, how we should actually utilize landscape architecture. As soon as you draw a line on a piece of paper, it's a political act. It actually affects someone. And so being able to utilize it on the front end opens up the aperture to the skills that landscape architects actually have to have a positive change on society.
That's very true. Maybe we have another one. It says, from Jessica. She says, many of you spoke about art being an inspiration. I don't hear much about art at ASLA events. It's mostly about climate change. But I'm passionate about art and social justice. How can art and landscape architecture be a tool for social justice?
A great question.
Well, I think I could just speak to that. I mean, I can't give a proposal right now, but I think in terms of just the work that I've been doing in the last 5 years, where I've just started creating these more temporary installations, they all had different contexts for them. Some were about climate change. Some of them are about just transforming how a current space is used, creating positive change in a community, creating a sense of safety in a community. And so I think that's where landscape architecture can be so transformative. That kind of blurring the line between art and landscape is that you can take these temporary installations and create whatever you want with them. And so I showed you a handful of different examples where, it's like rubberized mounds to create a kind of play experience on a street, like a really hostile street that's not, pedestrian friendly, to a light-based installation where I work with local makers to just transform a street. And so there's just such different ways that you can use a lightweight, low-cost materials to push for change. And so that's been incredibly beneficial, because the impact, it's kind of low cost for large impact. And so those tools can be used for any kind of mission or change you want to have. And so that can definitely be applied to social justice issues.
Yeah, and I just want to add, any sort of art we make is part of the visual culture that reflects our values as a society. Look at the the images that CL was showing about Richmond, those monuments that were put up 100+ years ago. We don't want those to reflect our values anymore, and so they're coming down. And so what are we producing now that is reflecting the values that we do want to assert? So that's less specific than Kimberly's answer, but I think really important to think about when we're making.
Yeah, that definitely speaks to social justice and change for sure. There was an earlier question for CL from Christopher. How would you say your research differs from that of other academic disciplines that deal with documenting narratives? Example, cultural anthropology, sociology, etc., etc. Do you look to those disciplines for methodologies and inspiration?
Yeah, I do. I don't see it as different. I actually see it as something that maps onto. It's a way to take those types of research methods and bring them into the forefront in terms of how we can use them in design and design education, design thinking, and design questioning, really. And also, bringing in some rigor when it comes to research. not, a lot of times we talk about the binary of, quantitative and qualitative kind of stuff, but, there's mixed methods in there. There's ways to actually be embedded with communities. And again, I always talk about listening first. I think that's really a really important thing. That does come from, anthropology, ethnography type studies to enable to use narratives and stories. And then we can apply, the methods and tools, the synthesizing that landscape architects are really great at, to actually highlight the skills that make our profession unique, but puts it in a way that may be more digestible for folks who don't understand what we do.
Here's a question for Tim. I live outside of the US, and I'm curious to see if you're finding landscape architects are having more discussions and involvement with historic housing. You mentioned Richmond.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say that, landscape architects are having more involvement in housing issues, particularly in the Bay Area, where the housing affordability crisis is, constantly on all of our minds, and, beginning to, find solutions for that are, have a root in landscape answers, but also, to give a shout out to landscape architects in general. I just think we have a way of thinking in the whole, on holistic terms, in terms of ecology and history and justice, that I think is sometimes lost on other design practitioners. And so I feel like when we do talk about housing, we have a tendency to talk about it much more holistically in terms of lifeways and in terms of the ongoing stories that yielded certain housing practices like redlining in North Richmond or East Oakland. And so I think increasingly, yes, particularly in the Bay Area.
I guess there's a question for the panelists. Anyone can jump in on this one. How did you balance personal social equity pursuits whilst also doing 40+ hours at a design firm, especially early in your career? Did you just have the support of your firm to take time off, utilize resources, etc.? Or was this all done in your own time?
I can answer just in terms of Atlas being a think tank for 5 years while working 40+ hours a week. There is no balance. I would work the nights and weekends, and it was actually helpful in terms of having a competition, because at least I would have a deadline associated with it that would push. But for the most part, it was done independent of the practice that I was at. It was acknowledged because it was not in conflict with the firm I was working at. And so it was okay because to pursue it. And so that, I say it's crazy, but I think it's very helpful because you kind of start to find your voice. And some people have that within the practice right away, and they have a mentor, or the firm engages a particular, engages you and supports you in your mission. But for me, it was like I was just trying to find my voice while working. And so that was just worked for me. To kind of just not have to worry about client expectations and trying to balance, what my sensibilities were at the same time and what my interests were.
I would probably just add that I think good firms get it. Yeah. And speaking for Methuen for a second, there's a real, I think, acknowledgement amongst the leaders of the firm that, everybody wants to work with collaborators who are real, full, complete people who have interests that drive them, that then reinform them as designers. And so supporting those efforts is, I think, the mark of a good culture of a good firm. Having said that, I think in my slightly younger days, I just didn't differentiate, design and outside work design. It was just always blurry, and so, and I just kind of didn't think of it differently. It was all just sort of being in that kind of life of a designer in a way. And you know, that one of my first jobs was at a firm called Royston Hamamoto, Alley and Abbey, RHAA, here in the Bay Area. And you know, I think I may have been a little bit of an anomaly in that way at that firm at that time, but the, you know, the leadership got it. And, you know, I think when good people see passion, they respond positively to it.
And here's a question for Grace. What can we look forward to with the release of the book on Black Landscapes Matter? What have you learned from being of this process and being part of this process? And how would you encourage others to be more thoughtful in our practice of landscape architecture?
So what can we look forward to? I mean, I think just in terms of encouraging others and what I've learned, it's just, you know, I think what has been kind of overriding themes of this whole evening is just, you know, listening to people's stories and, you know, engaging them in your work in really sincere ways, which is really hard. I think like sincerity and translating that into design work. You know, I am not, you know, I would not say I know how to do that, but I'd say like trying to do that is the first step to doing that. But just all the stories that I think are in the volume, and all the specificities of those stories, I think are really rich. And you know, just looking for those in your work, I think is really important, and listening.
Nice. All right, so we have
the other people.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I'm sure the other panelists who are more experienced designers than myself could probably similarly answer this question from their own experience.
Well, yeah, I guess CL, you have a book coming out. What are you most looking forward to, and with your new project coming out?
Yeah, it's interesting. We were pretty close to being what we thought done with the manuscripts, and then look at the context of what's happening in the world, and we realized that, you know, we needed to make sure we captured what's happening in today, right? To really bring it up to speed, and that was only, you know, 7 months ago, and you look how much things have changed. Yeah, and it's also pushed us to think about how, you know, one with the writing, but now with studios and things, with this semester coming up and different projects that we can work on and get our students engaged. And I actually thinking about, I'm just talking about in the context of Virginia, we know a lot of attention gets paid to Charlottesville and to Richmond. But the Confederate narrative is throughout the Commonwealth, and now we're starting to work with smaller towns to really understand the impacts of, you know, these symbols in public space and what people are actually feeling, having to pass by these every day. And it's going to be a continual narrative until we, hopefully it becomes a narrative of hope and not fear moving forward. So we will see what happens, and we have a lot more work to do.
Definitely. I guess we have one more question from our guest for Grace, and then maybe we'll open it up to the panelists to either close or ask each other a question. So for Grace, how did you go about researching sea level rise in Hawaii, and how have your findings impacted your designs? I guess particularly for coastal projects involving sea level rise.
Yeah, so I got involved, well, as I mentioned, Christina Hill introduced me to this topic, and then I started sort of delving into all the research behind it, and that led me to some of the first papers, research papers that came out of the University of Hawaii. And so then I had a grant to go to Hawaii. And so that's how, literally how I got there. Then in terms of how they've impacted my designs, I think it's just, you know, the most important thing is just thinking of sea level rise as something that's not, that doesn't just affect the coastline. You know, it's not just overland flooding, but it's flooding that happens further inland. And so being able to design things, design spaces that just are more capable of receiving flux than we're used to thinking about. And I think that's, you know, going to become a reality for coastal cities everywhere. And I think it's going to become a reality in more sites within those coastal cities than a lot of places realize. And, you know, places like Miami, you know, are already seeing that and realizing that and doing things about it. So, yeah.
Nice.
I hopefully that answered a little bit.
So, all right. So I guess, Michelle, should we close out and ask
We're
the
having
panelists?
so much fun.
I know, we have 5 more minutes left. Definitely want to respect everyone's time. We really appreciate everybody for coming out. And maybe if we can just do one more last round from everyone, whether it be, you know, something that you learned from someone who spoke today, or a piece of advice that you want to give our audience. I guess it's your 1 minute or so to kind of give some last words. So I guess we'll go in the order of what we presented. So CL.
Yeah, I think my lasting piece will be to really think about the relationships that you can build as a landscape architect and the work that comes out of the work that you do. That includes other landscape architects, community members, allied professionals, unallied professionals, and really think about not being fearful to insert yourselves in conversations, particularly where we're needed as designers to help save the world.
Nice.
That's all I have.
Great. Yeah, and I think I'd echo that and just say that, you know, my biggest advice is don't wait for opportunities. You have to create them. And that has literally been the change and the huge shift in my career. It was, you know, sitting at a desk, working. You know, you get assigned a project and you just work and your head's down. And the moment that, you know, you engage the community around you, and that, again, that's showing up for different organizations, different design, whether it's in the landscape or the architecture world, the real estate world, different nonprofits in your area. Get involved with and sit at the table. And it's amazing how design becomes a tool to help. You might think you're like, why am I here? I don't know how I can help as a designer, but those opportunities start to emerge. And so again, get involved in your community and don't be shy. And sometimes I can be a little introverted in that way. And I can put my head down a little too much. And so that has been really transformative. So I encourage everybody to get involved in their community, and things will happen.
And Tim?
Yeah, I would second and third, such as it is, everything CL and Kimberly both just touched on. I guess I would also just offer that just don't ever stop questioning. That relates to the design process in terms of iteration, and, you know, but it also just relates to the way you see the world and the way you see yourself. And I think that constant questioning, you know, leads you somewhere great. If nothing else, it leads you to questioning, which is great. And so I think the constant questioning is a good mode to be in. Like, question question landscape architecture as a mode. I mean, earlier we were talking about, well, art or landscape. I was like, the next generation, y'all should just blow that up. Like, it is what it is. Other people need a label for it. They can put it on it, but, you know, keep the questioning and keep listening and keep, you know, keep justice in your mind and keep making decisions based on that.
Awesome. And Grace, you have the last minute.
Yeah, okay, well, I guess sort of going off of what everyone else has just said, as I too have really found a lot of opportunities, like using what I've learned in landscape architecture and then looking for sort of links to other disciplines outside of it. So, you know, I ended up in Hawaii through like the journalism school. I ended up in Normandy with, you know, a preservation within like the historic preservation field, and like really thinking about how landscape can participate and work with these other fields. And I think that has led to a lot of opportunities. So I'd encourage other people to, as landscape architects, engage with people in other fields outside, because I think that can lead to lots of exciting work.
Definitely.
Well, thank you again, panelists. Thank you, audience members, for joining us. I want to point out that Blake posted in the message area of the chat some ways to participate for the ASLA Northern California chapter. And we look forward to seeing you participate in the future. And thank you again. And you'll see this video posted to our website in the near future as well.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening and weekend. Happy Friday.
Cheers.
Stay safe.
Have a good night. Bye.